What is going on, everybody? Today I am here with the man with the plan, the founder and the lead attorney on the DNC fraud. What is going on, my friend?
Nice to be with you, my friend.
As
Always good to
always,
see you.
as always. So it's been a long, 4 years. We're on 4 years. The DNC fraud lawsuit has been up and down and side to side. The coverage of it has been mostly abysmal. Mostly abysmal. We've seen cases rise and fall of similar stature. The DNC tried to sue Julian Assange in Russia, however the hell that works. It was immediately thrown out, and we
Right.
saw nothing come of it. There have been several cases like that, but with the tenacity of you and Liz and the other attorneys, the DNC fraud lawsuit is still around, and we are now in the Supreme Court. So if you could tell people what exactly is happening, how do we get to the Supreme Court, and what is going to be the goal when we get there? Because some people are kind of confused about how
Yeah.
the process works.
Yeah. Let me give a brief overview because I know a lot of people are kind of joining this story in the middle and they're real concerned about what's happening to Bernie Sanders in 2020. But this lawsuit that my firm filed was actually back in 2016, which was the first season of let's call it a season of the performance of the DNC rigs the elections against Bernie Sanders. Now we're in season two, and we notice that the plot is the same and a lot of the actions are the same for those of us that have been through this the first time
I would say it's
around.
gotten worse even.
Even worse, even more blatant. Back in 2016, my wife and I were big Bernie supporters, and we put a lot of our own resources into his campaign. We made videos to support his campaign. We did phone bangs, we did burn storms. We were part of the huge energy that surrounded the Bernie Sanders movement in 2016. And then we started seeing signs that the process was not being done the right way. And by that I mean
That's putting it kindly.
that's right. But we were still in a state of ignorance because we didn't quite know what was going on. I mean, this is the first time that we were really threw ourselves into a political campaign, in my life, at least. So we were kind of naive, I guess you would say. And so we were trying to figure things out. And then you actually walked into our office. This is back in spring of 2016, and you had some really damning evidence that Bernie Sanders was actually being undermined from within his own campaign in North and South Carolina. And you provided us with social media postings and other materials that showed that people were literally switching from supporting Bernie
FEC
Sanders.
documents. We had FEC documents. People will work, as a consultant for Hillary Clinton or one of her super PACs, and then literally a month, their payment had just gone through. A month later, they were, or not even sometimes weeks later, they were on the Bernie Sanders campaign. Yeah, it was bad.
Yes, so we saw exactly. We saw you brought us evidence, strong evidence of infiltration. People, one day they would be working for Bernie Sanders, and then after, the primary was concluded in South Carolina, they're on Twitter and they're like, "Go Hillary!" I'm
Yeah.
all in for Hillary, and this is, some very suspicious stuff. And so we started investigating with you the possibility of actually bringing a class action lawsuit against the DNC based on what we were starting to see as a pattern in practice of rigging the election for Hillary Clinton. That investigation was ongoing. You were working out of our office. And then what happened in June of 2016? Well, this shadowy figure called Guccifer 2.0 dropped a whole bunch of documents on a public blog, which actually internal documents from the DNC, which showed that the DNC itself was advancing the Hillary Clinton campaign and not abiding by the principles of its own charter, which require the DNC to conduct the primary process in a fair and even-handed manner. And so now suddenly we had internal proof, memorandums, research, suddenly almost magically come into our hands.
WikiLeaks happened.
This was even before WikiLeaks, and this is kind of something that people may not be familiar with if they weren't following events closely at the time. But Guccifer 2.0 actually preceded WikiLeaks by several months, and a lot of people weren't really paying a huge amount of attention to it. But as lawyers already in the investigation process, because of what you had brought to us, we were on that very, very quickly. Yeah. And as soon as we got the Guccifer stuff, we started getting calls from Bernie Sanders supporters wondering if they had any legal recourse that they could bring right then and there. And this is even before the convention. This is in June of 2016. So we looked into it, and we decided that we had very strong and substantiated claims for fraud, negligent misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty, and others that we could file on the basis of what we got from the Guccifer 2.0 in federal court. And we did that in June. We filed our complaint as a class action. We hired Elizabeth, my wife and partner, hired a gentleman. Well, she hired a company called One Source Process in DC to serve the complaint on the DNC and its then chair, Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And this is, again, before Debbie Wasserman Schultz resigned as a result of these allegations at the convention.
We were literally at the convention when the WikiLeaks dropped, right?
Exactly.
Exactly. That day, yeah.
And she was ousted.
Got booed by our delegates, booed by her own delegates, remember?
I remember that. So Elizabeth hired One Source Process in D.C. to serve the complaint, and we actually came up with the idea of doing a live stream of the actual service of process to show the moment that this complaint was served at DNC headquarters. Well, interestingly and disturbingly enough, the DNC, when they made their appearance in the case, their lawyers made their appearance, they filed a motion to dismiss the case based on the contention that our process server, a gentleman by the name of Sean Lucas, had not served the correct person at the DNC headquarters. And
clearly without knowing that we had live streamed it.
Without knowing we had live streamed it, without knowing that we had a whole video at that point posted to YouTube, which showed the interchange between Sean Lucas and the DNC personnel accepting the complaint on behalf of the DNC and Wasserman Schultz. Well, we were in the process of thinking about how the best way to respond to this motion, and we were in the process of getting an affidavit from Sean Lucas himself as the person who would testify in federal court as to the correctness of service of process, when we got really one of the most shocking moments, probably most shocking moments of my life, which was the news over social media that Sean Lucas had been found dead on his bathroom floor by his girlfriend. And you have to put this in context, because this was not the first strange and unexpected death, because just 1 week before, a man by the name of Seth Rich had been found murdered on the streets of D.C. And by this time, of course, WikiLeaks had already dropped.
It was almost right after.
Right. They had dropped their documents, and Seth Rich was reputed to be the leaker. Mm-hmm. And then he was found murdered, still an unsolved murder, by the way.
Yeah, they're not even trying to investigate.
I believe it's the only, now this is an interesting fact I read, the only murder of a Caucasian in D.C. that has never been solved.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that's the only murder of a political consultant or official, because he was like a part of their outreach or with technology outreach or something like that. But
right.
Yeah,
He
it was a big deal.
He was not a low-level DNC person. He was actually in charge of voter outreach,
Voter outreach, that's what
as
it
you
was.
say, voter systems, voting integrity. There's actually video of him. I don't know if you can still find it on the internet, but I remember seeing a video where he got up and spoke to these issues at a conference on voter integrity. And of course, there's a lot of evidence that he was a strong Bernie Sanders supporter. In any case, that murder is unsolved. Sean Lucas's very unexpected death came a week after, and suddenly, within a span of a week, we had not one but two dead witnesses in a federal lawsuit because Seth Rich, outside of whether or not he was a leaker, and I have no knowledge one way or another on that. Outside of whether he was a leaker, he would have been a witness in our case, and a very, very important witness because he was in charge of, voting integrity issues.
He was literally not just for like the Hillary Clinton campaign, but for the DNC specifically. So any complaints that he may have received, anything that he may have had to reconcile or send his team to reconcile, that would have been massive for us in the discovery stage when, if he has to cross-examine him.
Yes.
And it also should be mentioned about Sean Lucas that Jared, obviously as an attorney who hired Sean Lucas and as a lawyer, and then myself, none of us were able to get a autopsy on Sean Lucas.
That's right. We've got an email from the DC police that reports on his death and summarizes findings of 3 different substances in his body, which are unusual to be found in a combination. Everything I've seen and heard about Sean Lucas as a person, I didn't know him personally, but was that he was not a drug user, that he was in excellent physical health, a young man. I think he was in his late 20s. So, when this all happened, the lawyers on the legal team, we basically had a powwow, and we were basically, in a state of shock because we took this to be a direct message to us that, if you keep involved with this case, these things are going to happen to you.
Brandon Wiseman, the guy who was also investigating, I don't know if it was Debbie Wasserman Schultz specifically, but something in that district. It was the federal lawyer the black federal lawyer who appeared on the beach.
So he was a prominent lawyer in South Florida his body washed up in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And he actually worked for, I believe he was a federal attorney at the time. So, it's been said that he was working on issues of immigration fraud or something, but I've never gotten any real hard evidence on that. The official report on him is it was a suicide, but
he threw himself in the water.
Yeah, he was found in the water. So that was
in a bag too, right?
I don't know if it was a bag. I really,
I can't remember.
don't know how that. Don't know the exact circumstances, but that also happened in the same time frame.
Yeah, that's what was freaky about it. This is all happening within maybe a month and a half of each other.
Yeah, so we were, wondering, does it even make sense for us to continue with this? We all have families, to worry about. How much do you want to put yourself in harm's way? What the heck is going on? But we all decided that, we had to continue with this case because, if you're not going to stand on your principles in life, what else do you have? And I think, we have a very principled legal team that when we, we're very stubborn. When we get a case, we stick with it till the bitter end. Whatever happens. Not all lawyers are like that, and I think it's what makes our practice unique. But in any case, back to what was going on. We actually had a hearing about the service of process issue, and it was, I remember at the time, I believe you were there in the courtroom.
Yes.
This was in front of Judge Zlock in Fort Lauderdale. It was a pretty packed house. A lot of people in the audience. There was a lot of concerned people who showed up, just very angry about the treatment that Bernie Sanders was getting at the time. Also very alarmed by the murder of Seth Rich and the death of Sean Lucas, and they were interested to see what was going to happen. We had an extensive hearing in which we played the video. Ultimately, the judge issued a ruling in which he admonished the DNC for its conduct in the case around the service of process, but he directed us to reserve the complaint on the DNC to ensure that there would be no issues with the service question as the case moved up, which we did, and we had no problem the second time around. And then that led to the DNC filing another motion to dismiss based on the concept that the DNC is a private organization and that its First Amendment rights would be threatened by our ability as Bernie Sanders donors, supporters, Democratic Party voters to bring a lawsuit and potentially get a judgment against the DNC. And that was the main argument they made. They made other arguments as well. So we had a second hearing in front of Judge Zlock on those issues. Very long hearing. The judge came prepared with a whole series of questions that he wanted answered, and it was actually at that hearing that the DNC's lawyer, the main lawyer for the DNC, a gentleman by the name of Bruce Spiva, got up and declared in open court that in the view of the DNC, they had the right to choose the candidate, the nominee, any way they wanted to, even in his own words, to paraphrase, by going into back rooms and smoking cigars and picking the candidates that way.
And he said it was not obligatory for them to follow their own charter.
Correct.
which was
Correct.
bizarre, by the way.
Right. It is bizarre, and according to the DNC's counsel, the charter is basically a meaningless political rhetoric and not a binding obligation. And that was another argument they made.
Which, if I may add, is not true, because the DNC is a nonprofit organization. And nonprofit organizations, so I've looked into starting nonprofits a lot. And one of the things that you have to do in order to actually get the incorporation is to create a charter. And very specifically follow that charter. And if you break the rules of that charter while taking money from donors, of any size, that's actually the number one reason that nonprofits get sued. And a lot of people don't know that.
Right.
But and Bruce Spiva tried to make it completely political.
Right.
The whole conversation was politicized,
Right.
rather than just arguing the facts that this 501c3 or 501c4, probably C4, right? Probably C4. So this 501c4, instead of making that argument, he was making it, this is about the Democratic Party. It's about parties, and those are so obscure and abstract, and we don't know what a party is. What is a party? Can we? It was interesting to see. I guess I expected him to take that angle, but I just was hoping, that the judge would bring up, hold on, I know you keep saying it's a party, but it's just suing DNC's, Services Corporation, not the party.
Well, you're smarter than me, Niko, because I didn't expect Spiva to get up there and actually say in open court that the DNC had no obligation to follow its charter, and that could actually go into back rooms and pick the candidates.
That I was not expecting.
Because not only is that just kind of a ludicrous argument on its face, but in terms of getting people to stay in the Democratic Party, join the Democratic Party, identify with the Democratic Party, I mean, it's political poison to do that on the record. And this is something that I think this was a very important moment in this case, because by virtue of what Spiva said in court, we secured a very important admission from the DNC about how it conducts its affairs. So irrespective of whether the DNC is correct or not about the binding nature of this charter, the DNC believes it has the right to rig elections.
Yeah,
and that's very
And
important.
Judge Locke did say, and even though he, dismissed it on jurisdictional issues, he did say in that final, or not the final order, but the dismissal, that he does not recognize he said the trivialization
Correct.
of the DNC's
Right.
charter.
He would not accept the trivialization of the DNC's charter obligation. He dismissed us on jurisdictional grounds, essentially accepting the argument that there were First Amendment concerns given the rights of the political party to associate and ultimately conduct its affairs, and that, in his view, the remedy was with the voters and not the courts. And he relied on some Supreme Court case law for this order. He also said something very interesting at one of the hearings. I actually think it was, I don't know if it was the first. No, I think it was the second hearing.
Because Locke was talkative, so it's probably
right.
the
The second hearing, at the very end, he said that, and this is a direct quote, that democracy demands the truth so that the people can make intelligent decisions. And I think, there's many ways to read that statement, but I think what he was getting at, in light of the order that he ultimately did issue, was that it's important, regardless of what the judicial outcome of a case like this is, it's important for the truth of how the Democratic Party runs its affairs to come into public view, because ultimately it's a matter for the voters to accept or reject these practices at the ballot box. Now, I don't agree with Judge Locke's order, and I don't necessarily agree with that line of thinking, but I think in his mind he was trying to reconcile what I believe he saw as just outrageous conduct with his belief that the courts really don't have jurisdiction over a dispute like this.
Yeah, he was not very friendly towards Bruce Spivak.
Yeah.
He was not friendly that entire. But I agree with you. I think that he was under this impression that, we should leave it up to the voters to punish the DNC. But
Right.
at that point, which is once again my main issue with the dismissal, is the fact that it's not a voter. It's not necessarily a vote. Like, who do you vote for matter? Which party you vote for matter? It is quite literally a matter of a rejection of a fiduciary duty that is
Right.
outlined exclusively in your charter. And if we're going to hold, for example, if the Red Cross, took money, they have, but if somebody sued them because they got caught taking money and then doing something else with that money, then they would be sued, and you would not argue, it's up for the voter to decide. It's up to the donor to decide not to
Right.
donate to them. It's like, no, it's already happened. These voters have already participated. They were making a decision already,
Right.
in the assumption that, okay, I'm assuming that the Democratic Party is at the very least trying to do what they can to win.
Right.
And beat Trump, and then they're going to act objectively, even-handedly, as the chair of the Democratic Party said, and as the Democrats themselves have said over and over again. But that's not what took place, and they had already voted. So that was my main issue with the dismissal.
Right.
Even though Locke did, like I said, there was not really I'm glad that he was very clear in the dismissal that he does not accept the trivialization of the charter, because that could have been actually massive.
Yeah.
Could have been bad
Right.
for the future.
Right, right. So yeah, it's interesting because once you get into the appellate phase of a case like this, and that's where we're at now, you can really dig into these issues in depth and go into the case law at a level that you're not able to penetrate in the trial court, simply because you don't have as much time to drill down on every argument. And that's what we're doing now. We took the case up first to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeal, which is the first level of the federal appellate system, and we made the arguments that you just alluded to, focusing on the issue of fiduciary duty owed by a political party to its members, focusing on the concept of fraud, the fact that people paid money in reliance on this being a fair election. So if it's not a fair election, it's just like any other fraudulent Ponzi scheme out there. I mean, if somebody sells you a bill of goods and you pay, money and reliance on it, and turns out that they've made material misrepresentations to you. And remember, back in 2016, the DNC was all over the place in the media trying to do damage control and assure people that this was a fair and even-handed process. And there were a number of statements we cited in our complaint from Debbie Wasserman Schultz herself, as well as the press secretary and so forth, that actually tried to reiterate that they were following their charter.
Yeah.
And so there was public statement. Now, it's interesting, this time around 2020, you don't see the DNC really, they're not even trying to pretend anymore. It's like, we're going to cancel the election.
Yeah, right.
I mean, Clyburn got up the other day, and he's like,
just cancel the debates.
Well, just cancel the primaries. Just come on. It's Joe Biden.
What do you do? What do you like? You can't just give him the nomination at that point. You literally cannot do that because you're so well. I'm about to say let's not. What can and can't. We have very different definitions, of course, but it would be interesting to see what happens if they try and quote unquote cancel these elections, and then just try and nominate Joe Biden, in some weird way because. In my humble opinion, if they try and cancel the election, they say, well, we'll base it off of whoever the winner is so far. And I know Bernie is challenging and dealing with California. Those delegates haven't even all been allocated, and it's whatever the challenge is it's going to benefit him because it's the county that he was supposed to do the best in. And then you have a situation where they could try to cancel it and then say, oh, we'll do it based off of who wins. But then what if Bernie wins? What are they going to do at that point? So I
think there's more developments on the horizon for this. I just read an article today, I think it was in Foreign Policy, which made the case for basically canceling the entire election. I think they were not even talking just about the primaries, but the whole thing.
So just move it a year up?
And this is all to do with coronavirus. I don't know if move it a year up or declare a state of emergency or whatever, but I think this is where the coronavirus is kind of dovetailing with, the DNC's desire to get rid of the democratic process.
It might even have to do with the fact that they are very, very aware that Joe Biden cannot beat Trump. And doing this kind of puts them in a position where they can stop rigging out because they're getting caught. It's very obvious. And people who were a little bit hesitant to call it rigging last election are much more overt about it. And so this makes it so that they don't have to run Biden.
Right.
They lose to Trump and say, oh, this is just, they're making this suggestion in the elections, but then they're going to be like, this is tyranny. We wish we could not have another 4-year Trumps, but we're in a state of emergency.
So let me pose a question on this. I mean, we've just learned today that the NBA season is canceled, right?
Yes.
Okay. So how are we going to have a convention in Milwaukee? How is that possible?
Yeah, I don't. Well, so the NBA season is postponed or is suspended basically. So they're hoping
indefinitely.
Indefinitely. Some place people are saying 30 days for some events, but the NBA specifically is indefinitely. So they're hoping I was just listening to the radio this morning, but they're hoping that within the next 30 days they come up with a legitimate solution. There's a lot of money involved, so I imagine now that there's this much money involved, we're gonna get a solution real goddamn quick.
But I mean, Angela Merkel in Germany is telling us that 70% of Germans are gonna get the coronavirus.
Yeah, that's crazy. I don't even understand.
Now, whether or not that's correct, that leads me to believe that we're not going to have a solution within the next 30 days, that this is going to linger.
Yeah, but I also think it's because it wasn't being taken as seriously by parties as it should have been, by all the countries as it should have been. But like I said, when you're talking about the NBA, NFL is they're kind of right now, the MLB, the Premier League, English Premier League just indefinitely suspended their games.
And isn't the NCAA doing March Madness in front of empty?
Well, yeah, but now a bunch of people are canceling. A bunch of conferences just canceled this morning. Okay. So it's going to be interesting now that we have this literally multi-billion-dollar industries that affect all the Western countries. Kind of now we're losing money. Somebody better figure this shit out quick. Usually when people's money are on the line, all of a sudden you figure out a solution pretty fast. Yeah. But I do want to say, we're in the appeals court, right? We're in 11th Circuit Appeals Court. Right. We argued in court in front of 3 judges, right?
It was a 3-judge panel headed up by Judge Adalberto Jordan, who's a very respected jurist on the 11th Circuit. I've had cases in front of him and when he was a trial judge in the Southern District of Florida. And we had a pretty lively discussion, I would say. The judges had a lot of questions. We actually won on one of the issues. This kind of gets lost. I mean, there really has been no consistent reporting about this case. No. There have been some outlets that have, done a good job writing articles, but I mean, it's never been in the mainstream media.
It was when they tried to pretend like it was just a bunch of angry voters who had burning laws.
Yeah. The Washington Post actually characterized it as a frivolous lawsuit, even though if you read Judge Locke's order, the last thing you would come away from thinking is that it's a frivolous case, given the very strong language that he uses to describe the DNC's conduct and the trivialization of its obligations.
He seemed pretty pissed. The whole, the entire, the response that he gave was just. Like the conclusion was confusing to us. I will say that. Yeah. We were like, hold up, okay, I read all this, and then you're like, but jurisdiction.
Right. But I'll tell you this: judges don't have 4-hour hearings in frivolous cases. They don't have time for that. So that was, an instance. Really, the only mainstream article that I can think of was in the Washington Post by that guy. I can't remember his name, but he, basically defamed us. I mean, we had a nice segment on Russia Today with Lee Camp, but other than that, I mean, there's been, this has not entered the national consciousness because it's not something that anybody in the mainstream media, CNN or Fox for that matter, wants to report on.
It's inconvenient. It's very, very. I mean, when you have your lawyer who's representing you, so that you can choose, whoever the hell you want to. By the way, completely unnecessary argument. It was a completely if you understood the context of that dismissal hearing, it was completely unnecessary. But he made the argument anyway.
Right. Well, I think he was, like you pointed out, he was actually really trying to push the envelope and get a ruling that actually found that as a conclusion of law, because that would insulate them from any future liability.
Mm-hmm. And so, once again, great that Judge Locke nipped that in the bud immediately.
Right. I mean, and that itself was an important victory.
So now we're in 11th Circuit Court. I remember, I was there for that too.
Right.
I remember he once again tried to hyper-politicize it. There were a lot of questions, from the judges to both of you all. He actually seemed a little bit less prepared that time than he was last time. He was, but the judges also, from my vantage point, by the time you all both finished your arguments, the judges seemed to be confused. Yeah. Like they didn't even know really what to do or how to handle the situation, because it seemed like they just were not able to codify exactly what to call it. Like, is this purely political, or is there like a legitimate fiduciary duty issue?
Right.
Because it kept getting, every time you tried to bring it back to the fiduciary duty, he would drag it back into politics, and everybody knows that politics cases in these situations, usually don't even make it to the appellate court, first of all.
Correct.
They just get dismissed.
Right. They get dismissed, and the lawyers aren't really committed to taking it all the way. I don't see this as a politics case anymore. I mean, I've removed myself from supporting candidates. I haven't given or been involved in anybody's campaign in 2020. But I'm still very committed to this case because, as lawyers, we litigate the past, right? Yeah. And we have to bring it to a legal conclusion. The 11th Circuit upheld the dismissal. It issued a long order. It actually took quite a long time for the judges to issue their order, and it upheld the dismissal. And so the next step for us and what we're working on now is the Supreme Court. And our brief are in support of a petition for writ of certiorari, which is to get the Supreme Court to hear the case on the merits, is due March 26th. And it's been a very educational process for me. having written the first draft of what will ultimately be our writ. I mean, there's a lot of issues we bring up, but I think the main one is this fiduciary duty issue. And here's the really interesting thing that, finally congealed actually at the Supreme Court briefing level for me. And, again, you really dig into the case law at the appellate level. And the higher you go, the deeper you go. That's just kind of the nature of the process. And what I found, and what is going to be a major part of our brief, is a series of cases that goes back to the first half of the 20th century. They're called the white primary cases. And nobody teaches these cases in law school. I was completely unaware of the existence of these cases, and I took constitutional law with Larry Tribe at Harvard Law. So you would think that if you're going to cover this period of constitutional law, it's going to be in a class like that. But he completely skipped over it. And actually, the textbook that he uses devotes a tiny little section in this huge case book to basically briefly summarizing these cases in sort of a trivial way. And I don't remember ever studying them. But they're fascinating because they actually prove that everything the DNC has been telling us about its status as a private organization that is completely protected by the First Amendment and has no duty to its members and can do things the way it wants, everything is a complete lie.
Yeah.
And that this line of argument was already rejected by the Supreme Court in these cases that were brought by black voters in the South in the Jim Crow era, when after the Civil War, it was expressly defined in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that blacks would now have the right to vote. I mean, after all, there was a war over that. Slavery was ended, and blacks became actual citizens with the right to vote. Okay, that's what those amendments say. But of course,
make sure you go there.
Yes, the political establishment at the time tried to do everything in its power not to comply.
Yeah.
Right? And how did it do it? Well, it did it through the Democratic Party in the South, because the South didn't have Republicans at that time. This is after Reconstruction. They sent all the Republicans back up north, and basically the old Democratic Party was still in control. And it had what they were called white primaries. Okay? And what's a white primary? Well, they changed their rules and said that you cannot become a member of the Democratic Party unless you're white.
Which means essentially you couldn't even win office, nor could you vote for the people who are going to control the outcome of your lives.
Right.
Because there was no Republicans at the time.
Right. So. Right. In the South, there were no Republican candidates. There were only really primaries, because there was no Republicans to actually challenge the Democrats, and even if there were, they wouldn't have gotten any votes because the Democrats controlled everything. So there was actually a doctor in El Paso, Texas, a man by the name of forget his first name, but his last name was Nixon, and he was a black doctor. And he showed up at the polling station, and he asked for his ballot. Okay, this is back in 1920, and the polling officials were like, "Well, we can't give you a ballot." And he's like, "Well, what do you mean you can't give me a ballot? I mean, the Constitution now says that I have the right to vote." And they said, "Well, that may be so, but this is a primary, right? Not an election, primary, conducted by the Democratic Party, private enterprise, and the Democratic Party has determined that only white people can be members, right?" Okay, so he took that all the way up to the Supreme Court. And there were a series of cases, actually two involving Dr. Nixon, and then another case that followed on, and the Supreme Court had to deal with the same issues that we're talking about now, which is whether the Democratic Party can just set the rules and pick whoever they want, because they're free to set the rules however they want. And that includes, if they only want to, have an association of white people, that's their right, okay? And ultimately, it took a long time. It took years and years of litigation in multiple cases. But ultimately, the Supreme Court came to the result that, number one, Democratic primaries are elections under U.S. law. So the right to vote.
If you violate the law and you get caught, you will be prosecuted.
Right. So.
Oh, it happened. It happened in Hillary and Obama. They conducted whatchamacallit fraud, ballot signature fraud. Both campaigns got caught, and people actually went to jail over this in Illinois. So they have to follow the law, even in primaries. Oh shit, we should bring that up. Huh?
Right. Well, this is what we're. Well, this is exactly how the argument is going to be presented to the Supreme Court when we file the writ. But number one, these are elections. These aren't private get-togethers. So number two, and there was a very powerful opinion that the Supreme Court issued. This was in the 30s. Basically said that, look, if you allow the Democratic Party to circumvent constitutional rights, like the right to vote, by using, this fiction of a private association, then you've essentially circumvented the constitutional rights, and that can't be. Ultimately, that was the end of the white primaries because the Supreme Court declared them illegal, and that led us actually to the civil rights era. And
it seemed like a pretty defining moment. It seems like that was that was kind of part of the moment of the transition into the Democrats becoming what because they all of a sudden have to appeal to black voters. If you in certain areas, if you want to win, and that seems to cause you still have your Dixie cracks, but they had to change fundamentally with that ruling, which is crazy. That's why it's crazy that it's been basically erased.
It's been erased. It's been erased and superseded by a line of cases that really started in the 70s and 80s and started to really invoke the First Amendment as a protection against states from stepping in and really finally regulating the primary process.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Most of those cases are I lost and I want some retribution for that, correct?
Right.
But in the case that the white primaries, the case that you were just talking about, there's no winner or loser in that particular matchup, right? It's all before a winner has been decided.
Right.
In our case, same thing. A lot of people do not know this. Our case did not start after the convention and Bernie had lost because the main point of we didn't know if he was going to win or lose yet because he was actually still pretty competitive when we came up with the idea for this case. The main point was like there's not always going to be a Bernie Sanders, but it took him 70 years to build that type of infrastructure and that credibility. Not literally 70, but like 40 or 50. And so we don't know if another Bernie is even going to have the resources to compete against that amount of rigging and even be competitive.
Right.
And that's what it was more about. Like you're defrauding voters, making them believe they have a legitimate chance to get the candidate they want in, raising money off of this. Then Bernie's campaign was raising money off of it, and by necessity, giving part of that money to Act Blue, which effectively belongs to the DNC, and they give them some money. So ultimately, all the cases that have been dismissed basically were I lost, I didn't get what I want. Now, granted, some of them might have had legitimate grounds, but that it was winner or loser situations. And, but our case, the case that you were talking about, even that case in Illinois, like I was just discussing with you, those are not winner or loser. Like that process to prosecute them started before Hillary or Obama had been declared the victor in Illinois.
Correct. And when Dr. Nixon, goes to the polling station in El Paso, he's just trying to get his ballot.
Just the ballot.
Yeah, he's not concerned about winners or losers and who he's voting for. He just wants the right to participate. And what we are really going to try to do with the Supreme Court is stress that that kind of disenfranchisement is no different than the disenfranchisement that happens when you rig an election behind the scenes, because you're basically denying all of the people who don't want to vote for the Hillary Clinton or the Joe Biden the opportunity to meaningfully participate in the election as voters, which is what they are, because the Supreme Court has, contrary to what the DNC wants us to believe, it has established that Democratic primaries are elections.
It's going to be interesting to hear how I'm pretty sure the Supreme Court since then hasn't even heard anything close to that argument. Now, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
We know that the federal government provides a lot of funding for not only elections, but the voting machines
Right.
to pay for the officials that, monitor these elections. And obviously it's indiscriminate. The funds are given to both Republicans and Democrats in Republican Democrat-led counties. With that being said, we also know obviously that federal funding comes from American taxpayers. So could there be an argument that, yeah, the DNC is a private organization, however, federally, there is a certain way you have to run your elections?
Correct.
Federally speaking. And so if you don't do that, you're not only, obviously, you're defrauding the DNC and the donors for the DNC, but you're kind of now creeping into grounds of defrauding the American public. And if you can make a legitimate argument, okay, you just defrauded the American public, and that's illegal, how can we then say you can't, but you didn't defraud the Democratic Party members? It's just like, no, that's a different lawsuit.
Right.
But if that's a legitimate lawsuit with legitimate grounds, you can't then say a smaller sect of those people are not entitled to sue. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, and it actually parallels the reasoning in the white primary cases that the Supreme Court, in their opinions, issued in favor of the petitioner, saying basically that look at all the ways that the government supports these primaries. And this is back then, by the way.
State, federal?
Yeah, this is, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, when actually the government was a lot less involved with the primaries. But they still understood and accepted the argument that indeed this was an election that implicated the voting rights of the public at large.
Yeah. The Green Party and Libertarian Party are having trouble getting federal funding because of this, these two parties who are taking up the majority of the votes and the support. And so, once again, there are like real consequences to with dealing with where that funding goes based off of the decisions that the DNC and the Republican Party
It's
make.
interesting you bring up the concept of third parties, because that's actually, this is more of a corollary point to the main argument that we've been talking about that's going to be in the writ. But I think that goes to the dramatic way in which the Supreme Court has changed over the years. I mean, when you read these white primary cases, you see that the Supreme Court was actually a lot more of an engine for what would ultimately be the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, because it wasn't going to allow the Democratic Party to get away with sidestepping civil rights or voting rights. And it was very bold in enforcing those rights. Then when you see these later cases, and the one that comes to mind on the third parties issue, which I agree with you when you say that the third parties are essentially shut out of the process. There's this case that was decided in 1997 called Timmons versus New Party of Twin Cities, and it basically established the duopoly that we know now, and basically said that the two-party system is American democracy. Okay.
On what grounds?
It's incorrect grounds, actually. I think historically it's wrong. This was, an opinion that was, I can't remember who authored it, but maybe it was Rehnquist. But it's a terrible decision, because there's no support for this concept that In fact, the founding fathers
We're the opposite.
didn't want political parties
Yeah.
at all. Later on, two parties did develop early on, the Whigs and the Democrats. But there were other parties too that played a big role, and they would often cross-endorse candidates, and in this process called fusion. And eventually, the Democrats and then the Republican Party sort of conspired in the early 20th century to start passing or get the states to pass a lot of laws that make it very, very difficult for third parties to get on ballots. And that's
What that
actually-
probably had a lot to do with? So, a lot of people, this is a little bit of history for y'all. Theodore Roosevelt came in to the game with the Bull Moose Party
Right.
during the Woodrow Wilson election.
Yes.
And this is actually one of the times, people, that you can actually call him the spoiler, because he was a spoiler. However, what a lot of people don't know is that J.P. Morgan and Chase and the rest of those corporate tools, they bought him off to be the spoiler and funded the party to be the spoiler. And then, of course, that led to Woodrow Wilson winning, which ultimately he got re-elected, right? No, that was the first election. He got re-elected after that, but that's because he had ran on being an anti-interventionist. And then, of course, he won, even though he eventually tried to, he did successfully hawk us into World War I off on illegitimate grounds. Yeah. So, but what that ended up leading to, that Bull Moose Party, he was legitimately a spoiler. He was paid to be a spoiler, right. And a lot of people were fearful that the corporations would just buy off these party, because remember, everybody back then was isolationist. Everybody was, and so that there was a legitimate fear that they would buy off people, fund those campaigns just to split the vote in whatever area you needed to, because they had just been successful doing it with Theodore Roosevelt, and that's where that came from. Yeah. So even though it might have even been a noble act at the time, it might have seemed like one. Because Theodore Roosevelt running and being funded literally led to us into World War I. So it might have been noble at the time, but ultimately, we are definitely in a draconian, archaic duopoly that might have had a purpose at one point. Right. But with the advent of social media, just so many ways that the third parties could. It takes one time on the debate stage. Right. There's 44% of the country, 41, 28%, this is as of December 19th for everybody who's curious. 28% of the country is Republican, 28% of the country is Democrat, 41% of the country identify as independent. That is ridiculous. For us to not have a legitimate, viable third party, to have so many laws that prevent it at the state level, and then for the federal level to seemingly not really care, or people don't have the money to take it that high, maybe? Do you think that's it?
Well, no, I think the Supreme Court upheld all of the state regulations and said that there's a reasonable interest in having them and preventing third parties from shaking up the two-party system. It's pretty clear about that in this Timmons opinion. So that's 1997. So
that's pretty recent too,
yeah,
case law-wise.
It's a legally sanctioned duopoly. It's not just that it's developed to that point. It's the fact that the Supreme Court itself has endorsed this in black and white. So, in order to, I really think that in order for third parties to ever be viable in this country, you're going to have a Supreme Court that overrules that line of reasoning, which happens. I mean,
you get a Republican Party and then have the Green Party take it up to the Supreme Court.
They
might do it just to split the vote for the Democrats.
Look, I mean, if we don't, at the end of the day, I guess there are a number of ways we can undergo an authentic political transformation in this country, but I really do believe we're going to need the help of the courts at some point in some dramatic fashion.
Somebody's gonna, if you're one of those judges out there, if you're a federal judge and you're looking to make a name for yourself, hey, being part of history is a good way to make a name for yourself. It's a quick way to end up on the Supreme Court. I'm just saying, I'm just saying. Listen, I think that it's weird because history tends to throw us. History has shown that the universe throws democracy a bone. It's weird, right? I mean, in situations like what you described in Texas, of all places, a black doctor, which is already a rarity, had the time, the patience, and the money to go, and a lawyer to take him there. Right. To go all the way to the Supreme Court to ensure that black people can not only vote but register to be a Democrat
and
Jim Crow South.
Not only once did he do that, he had to do that twice because he actually won the first time, and then the Democratic Party came up with a way of circumventing that ruling.
As they generally do.
Right. So the next time,
even now,
and he actually had a funny quote at the end. I was reading, the short. It was his obituary, but it was kind of a biography. He was a fascinating guy. The second time he showed up to try to vote, he's talking to the poll worker, and he said, I have to ask for my ballot, and I know that you have to deny me it, and that's just the way it goes. Right? So I think he saw sort of the long process. I mean, he lived a very long life.
He knew what it meant long term. I think he also kind of felt that responsibility, because like I said, there weren't a lot of black doctors. There are not enough black doctors now, let alone in 1920, let alone in the South, and let alone with the courage to stand up to the process, knowing that it could literally mean you being lynched. Like that's not hyperbole.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely.
They could have ran his
doctor's
office.
It's amazing. It's amazing the courage that he had to stick his name out there and do this very. But, he was determined to enforce his constitutional right. And I draw a lot of strength from that example whenever I'm feeling sort of, depressed or down about the situation. It's just like, we can only do so much as human beings in this process. And we sort of have to take the longer view that we might be, a little bit part of something that's much bigger. Yeah. But you just have to kind of keep doing your thing, And he kept doing his thing, and he kept doing the way, I don't think he let it derail him. I don't think he let it derail his career as a doctor, and he lived a very long life. And as a result, he accomplished something very, very historically significant that accrued to the benefit of later generations, and I think that we're kind of all in that position right now.
And who knows? After we get to the Supreme Court, he might have just saved another generation from the Democratic Party inadvertently once again. So
it also, I have to tell you though, there's kind of a dark side to this whole these historical episodes that you read about in the case law. You realize that the Democratic Party, and I'm talking as somebody that was born into a Democratic Party family on both sides, okay?
New York Democrats too, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and, it was always taken for granted. I mean, my dad worked for a labor union. It was always taken for granted that the Democrats were the good guys, that Reagan, Bush, what have you, Nixon had been responsible for really screwing this country, and that, the Democrats were the people that were going to turn things around, and they stood for
Jimmy Carter had them fooled. Jimmy Carter and JFK really had them fooled, in my opinion.
Yeah, but it was always, it was the Democrats would stand for economic and social justice and, what have you, against, bigotry and corporations and what have you. When you look at this, you realize that Democratic Party's lineage is actually much different, and actually the notion of voter suppression is actually hardwired potentially in the Democratic DNA. Yeah. And we might be looking, when we look at these white primary cases, what we're actually looking at is the true face of the Democratic Party showing itself really not that long ago.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. Was Woodrow Wilson a Democrat?
He was.
Like he was.
Yes, he was.
And they worked to suppress the vote to get him in.
Yeah.
FDR, obviously a Democrat, and although, he had the money to combat a lot of that stuff, right?
Right.
But, as we know, Henry Wallace, who was as popular here in this country, but also much more popular internationally, he had his vote stolen. And it was conspired by the Dixiecrats to get Truman in, who was a Missouri Dixiecrat.
Correct.
He's a Missouri Dixiecrat. That dude was a different type of racist.
Yeah.
And he worked with the Republican Party, like Dulles, one of the Dulles brothers. That's who, and was literally guiding him for all this. And then of course you fast forward, and then you have. Yeah, you had JFK, but you also had Lyndon B. Johnson. People forget, JFK was like a rarity
Yeah.
And Lyndon B. Johnson was more of the norm.
He was absolutely the norm.
And he didn't do anything. People always say, he passed the Civil Rights Amendments.
He was best friends with all the segregationists.
Exactly.
That was his part. And another.
And that was almost how you got elected back then.
Yeah.
You had to be
Absolutely.
kind of one of the Dixiecrats or at least friends with that group.
Yeah. There's a speech from 1964 by Malcolm X that he delivered in Cleveland, which you can get on YouTube. And I think everybody who's interested in this stuff needs to listen to that speech because he basically rips the Democratic Party apart. Gets to the heart of it. And, he basically, everything he says in 1964, or maybe 63, the year before he was shot, it holds true today.
Yes.
And I really feel that if Malcolm X were alive today, he would be at the forefront of all of these issues and just being like, I told you so back in '64.
Yeah. Him and Martin Luther King both.
Right. Of course, when you're
Malcolm was a little bit more angry about it.
Yeah, when you're that bold and outspoken about it, you tend not to have a very long life in this country.
That's very true.
But I feel that if he were around today, Martin Luther King were around today, they would all be up there saying, like, what did you guys expect? I told you so. You think like this rigging, it's been any different in the Democratic Party. This is just the way they conduct business. Martin Luther King, a lot of people don't know that shortly before he was assassinated, he was making plans to run on a third party ticket that was going to be a combination civil rights, anti-Vietnam war ticket, and there was a lot of anxiety in the FBI, the CIA, that this was going to be politically transformative. And
look at what the Million Man March was already like.
Right.
And people forget, it wasn't like JFK would still be alive today. He was not old when he was maybe, 35? 36 when he was assassinated, if even.
I feel he was a little bit older than that. I don't know.
He was young. Like his prominence. Young. He was actually maybe in his early 30s, late 20s.
Right,
so he was going, not only was he going to be, he was already transformative at a very, very young age, which was kind of unheard of at the time, unless you were an academic or something to that extent or in politics directly. But on top of that, you're going to have to deal with him for a long time. And all the people who come after him.
And his family. This was going to be the dynasty to end all dynasties.
And you probably would have gotten your first black president a lot sooner. You probably, he and JFK, if Martin Luther King gets in politics, then he and JFK, and they don't assassinate either of them, him and JFK, MLK being an anti-imperialist, and then on top of that, of course, JFK coming into his anti-imperialist stances, it would have been a very transformative moment for everybody. Right? The Democratic Party might not look the same, the Republican Party might not. Third parties might be.
The country wouldn't look the same. I don't think we would have, I think JFK probably would have pulled the plug on the Cold War
much earlier.
Yeah. And we wouldn't have. He didn't want to be in Vietnam.
There would probably be no. He probably would have abolished. CIA.
Well, that was he actually committed to do that. He said he wanted to tear them to 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the winds.
Oh, I don't know. That's
and then he was assassinated. So we would have a much different country, and I think in some ways we'd have the country that we all kind of sometimes delude ourselves into thinking we have, because we don't all always fully acknowledge the extent to which our democracy's been compromised, and to the extent to what I think we fairly call the deep state actually runs the show now. And this is exactly what
they've been for a while too.
They've been there for a while. I think they consolidated their rule in 1963 when they blew JFK's brains out and in public view. And
it told you a bullshit story, and then classified all the documents, and which is insane.
Classified.
That's the wildest thing. You assassinate a president, and then first of all, y'all set him up for failure, because that was the first thing I thought. Like when I was in the military and I was studying JFK, and I was like, hold up, I've been on details for just generals, right? There's no way in hell you're letting a general ride around. A general, 1-star, in an open car in the middle of wartime, when it's a highly contentious, activists everywhere, highly contentious.
There had been threats against his life. plot had been broken up in Chicago just like the month before.
Yeah.
So they were
They
fully
blamed
aware.
the mob, and like that would have been really easy to do back then because
Well,
everybody.
they may have
did kinda know.
contracted some parts of the operation to the mob, like
Yeah,
Jack Ruby, but they were just contractors taking orders from
Yeah,
the
but also, like I
CIA.
said, it would have been easy to blame them because everybody at the time assumed that he
Right.
worked with the mob to get elected to begin
Right,
with.
right.
So
No, it's like now they have they go down their list of people to blame. They actually wanted to start with Russia, okay, and then they decided that probably
would be horrible.
So might have bad repercussions. So then they were like, it's Cuba. And I mean, you actually see the memos like going down this, and then they're like, "Oh, we're going to do the lone gunman," and then later on,
Who didn't remember?
What's
he
that?
didn't. He didn't even remember pulling the trigger or something like that.
Oh, Oswald said he was a patsy from.
Oh, I thought he said he didn't even remember pulling the trigger. Like
No, he never got that far. He actually, before Jack Ruby assassinated Oswald, also in plain view, he actually gave a statement at the police station in Dallas, and he said, "I'm just a patsy. I don't even know what I've been charged with." They actually
he straight up said was like, I'm doing what I'm told to do.
But the interesting thing about Oswald is that his CIA file is very, very thick, and it's very clear now that he actually was a deep state asset through and through. What exactly his operation was is not clear. It's possible that he thought that he was actually tracking an assassination plot against the president, so that he was sort of maneuvered into place by the very people.
How old do you think? How old was Lee Harvey Oswald when he passed? Do you remember?
He was, I want to say he was in his 30s.
Because when you're coming on the end of your CIA career, whether you're an official or unofficial asset,
Yeah.
if you're like in the black ops, they ask you to do one major job that could seriously implicate your livelihood if it got out that you were the one responsible.
Okay.
And so what they but if you deny the job, you're like done. They're going to come and they don't care. I mean, they'll have your friend walk up and blow your brains out if they have to, or they implicate you and frame you. So I wonder if it just happened to work out that maybe Lee Harvey Oswald, they had a job for him, and he was like, I'm not about to participate in that nonsense. He's like, I'm gonna get out the CIA, and they're like, oh, we need you to do one more job, and look at what happened. Maybe he was tracking. Maybe not even this. Maybe it wasn't even an assassination plot against JFK. It was just they got some news that somebody could be assassinated, and they're just trying. Because nobody would have thought that JFK was going to be assassinated. So maybe he got some news. They're like, oh, go find this, and they were like, you're in jail now. Right. And he was like, I'm a patsy, like because he's CIA, so he would know.
Right.
It's interesting. That's what happened.
He actually made a phone call from his jail cell to a number in North Carolina. And the researchers there are a lot of researchers that they do nothing but JFK, and they've been like parsing through all the files that have been released, all the historic data. There's lots and lots of interesting witnesses. People have made deathbed confessions. There's actually a really strong body of knowledge out there about what exactly happened. And Oswald, one of these weird things that Oswald did is he asked to make a call to North Carolina. It turns out that the guy he called was a longtime CIA himself. He didn't pick up the phone or anything, but he was a longtime CIA guy himself. And the theory is that he was calling what's called his cutout, which is the guy that you call if you're an agent when something goes really wrong in your mission. And you can't like come out of the cold, right?
Yeah.
And be like, hey, what's going on, guys? I'm on this mission.
So he
called.
because he's like, hold on, why am I in jail?
He had to trip like this signal, which is like, the operation's gone very, very wrong.
Guys, they're saying that I'm guilty of this. You're supposed to tell them I'm not, right?
Exactly. You're supposed to get on the phone with the Dallas police right now.
Oh, they got on the phone with somebody. That's why Lee Harvey Oswald is not.
Well,
the
guy he called did not respond or pick up, and he was.
That's interesting.
Snuffed out. Yeah, there's a whole lecture on it.
I wonder how long after he made that phone call was Oswald gone.
It was like the next day. Yeah, he was only in jail for a couple of days before Jack Ruby, who was definitely a mob guy.
Yeah,
He was
Jack Ruby.
Oh yeah, he had a long history with the Chicago and Texas mafias, and was he just shows up.
Democracy, everybody.
He was also all over the place on the day that JFK was assassinated. He was, there are reports of him being at the police station. There are reports of him, being at the scene. There are reports of him. I mean, he was like basically like the guy on the ground fixing things, and he himself also, died under mysterious circumstances.
If you get asked to kill somebody who supposedly killed JFK, you better believe that you're gonna, you know what I'm saying? Like, cause now I gotta worry about you. You know what I'm saying? Like, now I gotta worry about, cause especially if you do it out in the open, everybody knows who you are. It's easy to track somebody down like that.
He was between a rock and a hard place when he got that call, right?
That's also true, because if it's CIA calling you, you're like, shit.
Well, I think the original plan was for Oswald to die in a gunfight, because and it went wrong. I don't think he was actually supposed to be picked up by the cops. I think they wanted him to because he was actually picked up because he was accused, and this also is not clear what exactly went on here, but he supposedly killed a cop named Officer Tippett after the assassination as he was running from the scene. And they found him, and then he went to like this movie theater, and basically, was sort of going up and down the rows, kind of looking for somebody. So this may have been another.
Yeah, right. The guy, like, you told me.
If things go wrong, go meet at the Texas Theater.
Yeah, very specific. Yeah, that's what people used to meet. Y'all see the movies? That's where everybody meets whenever they. Probably where they got the idea from. That's where movies get it from.
But he was arrested at the movie theater.
So they knew they even knew where to find him.
They magically showed up.
Here's what's interesting about this. So y'all know police officers, right? Yeah, they suck at finding people. I'm being honest with you, they really are. They're bad at it. And even when they have excessive help, they're pretty bad. Like, you have to do something to tip them off even today for them to know where you're at. So it's weird because when you consider the trajectory of the shot, right, that not everybody is aware, it did not come from the angle that Lee Harvey Oswald was supposedly at. Mm-hmm. How the hell did they know to go chase after Lee Harvey Oswald specifically? Right. They're saying, oh, he killed a cop.
Right.
Like, but with what? I mean, he could have had another weapon on him, but like, how did he kill him? Right. Why would you draw attention to yourself after assassinating the president?
The rifle he supposedly used was left at the scene. And he fled.
Because all assassins leave rifles at the scenes.
Right. And it was an old, it wasn't like the FBI actually couldn't replicate the shot when they tried the forensic afterwards. So,
according to Marvel, Magneto actually bent the bullet.
Okay.
To assassinate JFK. According to Marvel.
Interesting.
So, Magneto, he bent the metal in the bullet. And that seems more plausible than the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald was actually guilty, by the way. So, now I do want to close up. So, what would be a successful outcome in the Supreme Court appeal that we're about to go through? What would, like, in layman's terms, for all the people who are, trying to understand exactly what's happening?
Yeah, so...
and what will happen next if we were successful?
So what we're filing on March 26th is what's called a petition for writ of certiorari, which is basically a special writ that the Supreme Court will issue to review the appellate and trial proceedings, not only from the highest state courts in the country, but also the federal appellate courts, such as the 11th Circuit, which is the last decision we got. Mm-hmm. They take very, very few cases. Okay, it's like winning the lottery. They get
what we're in right now.
Yeah, Supreme Court. Yeah, so this is like,
so this is a rare case already.
Well, no, they haven't made up a decision of whether they're going to take this yet.
Got you.
This is we're just filing the writ, but the chances are very low. The chances are very slim. I think it's like less than 0.6% or something. Ooh. Because this is the last court of resort for so many issues. I mean, and this includes every everybody who's been convicted of a crime, they can try to go up to the Supreme Court on what's called a writ of habeas corpus. Okay, and there's a lot of prisoners. A lot of them. I mean, they really have no other options than to write their own writs and file them with the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court, you can imagine, just gets thousands and thousands and thousands of cert petitions every year. They have a team of clerks which is assigned to read through all these petitions and provide memorandums to the justices at these conferences that they have every week to decide whether or not they're going to grant the petition. And granting the petition is only the first stage. That basically means that the court will put the case on its calendar, and then there will be a round of merits briefing, and the court may, in its order, say, we want to specifically hear on this issue, okay, or we want to specifically hear on that issue.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, it was even rare for us to even get to the 11th Circuit Appeals Court, right, and be heard in front of that.
Yeah, I mean, not all cases get oral argument. In fact, most don't.
It's like only like 7% or something like that, right?
So to even get like a panel argument like that and a published opinion is rare, and we got both. So that is a good thing. Obviously, we want to win the case, although we did win on some issues before the 11th Circuit that get lost in some of the reporting about this.
So if we won on some issues, why were those? First of all, what were those issues?
The issue was the court. At the end of the day, I think for the donors, and I'm not talking about the fiduciary duty claim, but the donor claim based on fraud, it felt that those donors, by virtue of the fact that they had paid money in reliance on what they alleged to be false statement, was enough to actually get in the door and have standing. But then they went to a next level of analysis and decided that the allegations were not specific enough about which representations they had relied on. Because remember...
What?
Yes, it's a very...
I thought you're supposed to make as many as you can. Like, there's a lot of representations that they relied on.
Well, and we listed them, but we didn't say for each plaintiff, I relied on this representation from Debbie Wasserman Schultz on this date, or I relied on this statement in the charter. So
correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that's supposed to be discussed in the actual the case is going through generally.
And this gets to another line of argument that we're making, which is that we weren't given a chance. And I litigated hundreds and hundreds of cases. Okay. Usually what happens is if the court, almost always what happens is if the court says, you know what, I think you have standing here, but there's not enough specificity because you're alleging fraud, we need more detail, they give you a chance to amend the complaint. Yeah. It's routine, okay? We were not given a chance to amend. We were never given a chance to amend this complaint in response to the arguments that... Yeah,
because he could have easily did it.
Easily.
We just go to damn Google.
So we're actually going to be submitting an amended complaint to the Supreme Court with our petition showing that all of those, lack of specificity claims that the 11th Circuit talked about are easily fixable. And Elizabeth's been on the phone with our clients, nonstop for the past couple weeks, calling them. We had 120 plaintiffs. I don't know that we're going to keep all 120 in the Supreme Court complaint, but I really feel that this is, so we did win on that issue. It's crazy to me. It just got...
It seemed like that would be the issue that would take it forward. And then they said, but you need to be mindful that you're going to have to be able to lay these claims out specifically when you go in front of the judge. Which was like, okay, we expected that, but we didn't expect that at this point, or we did that at this point.
So we're giving the Supreme Court an option, which is to say, look, if you don't want to get into the fiduciary duty claim, at the very least, give us a chance to litigate, because we have standing on these claims about the donors, but we just need to provide more detail, which is easily done, and here's the complaint. You can amend a complaint in the Supreme Court.
That's just super silly, though. I just feel like that's such a petty
reason. It was a procedural as opposed to a substantive dismissal, and I felt it was very it's contrary to
what the
Fed-
appellate court would, because they don't hear cases like not like that over like minor procedural,
Right.
or they don't make rulings off of minor procedural things. If you need to amend, they'll tell you in
Right.
advance before you even get to the point where you hear
It's
the oral argument.
common. Every time you go, I mean, they're not going to let you amend the complaint like 10 times, but they're going to at least let you have maybe 2 or 3 amendments to try to, get to the level of specificity
Do
that
you
they want.
think that because there was a judge that had to be replaced for some reason, right?
Right. There was a judge that recused herself in the 11th Circuit. We don't know why, but she.
Which is weird.
Yeah.
By the way, that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah.
But do you think that that perhaps that transition from one judge to the next, and then of course I think that judge is not even permanent. Like on the judge that they had take her place isn't even permanent on the 11th Circuit issue.
No, I think all 3 that we ended up getting were permanent 11th Circuit judges.
But not necessarily
One
permanent to hear all those types of cases. Or in
well, that's another interesting thing. We actually had an original panel that ruled on another jurisdictional issue in our favor about whether we had enough diversity of citizenship.
What?
Yeah, this is also it's all on the Jampack website if people want to follow this. I mean, there's been a lot. This is
Jampack.us.
Yeah,
Still. Okay.
Yeah. It's been a long legal.
That's crazy.
Battle.
I must have missed
Yeah,
that.
well, it's easy too. I mean, and a
so
lot
much,
of
yeah.
a lot of blood's been spilled on this, metaphorically and figuratively, and
I'm gonna put it like this, everybody.
you know,
Jared, so we had this office called where it was somebody who masked their voice to threaten I'm not going to say my name, but everybody who works in this office or frequents this office over this case. And the number went back to, if I'm not mistaken, the office of Debbie Wasserman Schultz,
Yeah.
correct?
it wasn't an explicit threat, but it was a voice that seemed to be using a voice changer technology that was just asking.
I had to pay, like my car was mysteriously towed while I was out of town, conveniently enough, and then I had to pay like $500 or $600 to get the car back out. Have had my car broken into. My wife's old vehicle got assigned a bunch of tickets after it was stolen. So they're saying that, oh yeah, you ran all these lights when we didn't even have the vehicle and we reported it. Like, this is the type of stuff that people deal with, and it's not just people deal with politics in general.
Yeah.
Deal with this type of is basically bullying and intimidation tactics and things like that. But
There
so
was
it is
somebody
stressful.
that said that American politics is a contact sport. I would say it's way beyond a contact sport.
It's a blood sport.
Yeah.
It's a blood sport. In every way you can think of.
And you find yourself in the crosshairs. It's very scary. I mean, we filed a motion with the court asking for federal marshal service protection at one point. This was the district court because it wasn't just the call, but our co-counsel had been getting very threatening emails. And just the whole host of things when you put that in the context of what happened with the witnesses. And the judge actually issued an order and said, I'm very sympathetic to your concerns, but federal marshals doesn't have the resources to protect the legal team and all 120 plaintiffs and their families.
Yeah.
Is what he was saying. And, at the end of the day, I mean,
But at least if you maybe protect the legal team, then in its news that these people are being protected, they would assume that there's protection in other, for the plaintiffs.
Right. But I mean, the thing is that, the judicial branch, it's been called the weakest branch of our government. And it doesn't, I think what's meant by that is it doesn't control the instruments of, power in our country in the way that other branches of government control the military and the police, and they have those kind of resources at their disposal. All the judiciary has is the federal marshals, and they're pretty stretched to the limit because we're running a prison state right now, and so.
True.
Well,
and the duopoly doesn't help, right?
Right.
Because in order to even be in a position where you can get on the Supreme Court,
right.
you have to go through, obviously, judges are elected
right
in the beginning, if you don't know. So if you are elected, that means you're running, and you cannot say whether you're Democrat or Republican when you're running, but infrastructurally, when you have people campaign for you and you're tapping into those resources, it's going to be from a Democratic or Republican establishment type of network. Yeah. So when you get to the federal judges, though, they're appointed.
They're appointed,
which means you have to be in the know with one of the parties at the highest levels. And so at the end of the day, just like in the 20s, the duopoly basically almost always does what it can to protect itself at the right moments. They may not get along all the time, but when it's time to protect their interests, they will coalesce for a bit.
Yeah.
And that's what I think happens a lot at the Supreme Court level. I mean, things don't get the way they are, naturally. There's a lot of things that are like weird, right? How do we even get to the point where every other country can have multiple parties and multiple people win, and then we don't? There has to be deliberate efforts to suppress democracy to the degree that it has been. And that's the question I think we should be like, how do we even get to this point? Like, why are we even having a discussion about the classification of JFK's documents? Why are we even, why do we even have to take the FBI to court for Martin Luther King's death? Like, why are we even at that point? Who okayed that shit? If the FBI was involved, the president knew. So if he didn't know, somebody damn knew. So that's what I think we really have to start addressing. And as we have cases like this one and others that have come along, as we're dealing with the election season right now, it's important to not only look at the candidates, but why are some candidates more acceptable than others? And you know what I'm saying? Like when we're looking at a candidate like Tulsi Gabbard, you have to wonder, not only wonder, her message cool, whatever. It's not just the message that is freaking people out. It's also the reality that she was part of the establishment, which means she knows a little bit about a lot. Yeah. And she talks about it and delves into it in her town halls and things like that. And she left it for because of the corruption, which means she's more than willing to speak on that corruption. Right. You have people,
and she's the last woman left in the race. Of course, you wouldn't know that from watching the media.
Yeah, Jill Stein. They're very clear. They are very intent on ensuring that people don't know she's a medical doctor.
Right.
Because their whole thing is to dehumanize her and delegitimize her as a professional. Right. And they don't call her Dr. Jill Stein or Dr. Stein as they do many other, all their colleagues that they respect. When they refer to Reverend Barber, they call him Reverend Barber or Dr. Reverend Barber. But that when they're talking, that's just what they do. You have to ask yourself, why don't they call her Dr. Stein, but they'll call all these, because there are steps that have to go into play if you want to decentralize centralize democracy and centralize the economy and centralize your government. And right now we're seeing right now, in my opinion, an executive branch with unprecedented power.
Yes.
A Congress even that has basically been castrated. Like they've had their balls cut off. Mm-hmm. Some of it self-imposed, but some of it actually came from the executive branch when they limited the amount of Congress members in the House, which it should be like 4,000 and there are only like 400. Yeah. And then of course you have the judicial branch, which we're the only country, I think, which is weird, right? Our presidents can only serve 2 terms, where in most other countries that's not the case. Right. But our judicial branch, which many could argue has more of an effect on the outcome of our democracy than either of the executive or the legislative branch, that's a lifetime appointment, and it's unelected.
Right.
And that's actually, I don't believe, is the case in most countries.
Right.
They have to go through a process where the people then vote, and then the Congress has to agree on it, and then the Congress nominates, not the president.
Or they serve terms, you know. I mean,
oh yeah, they almost always serve terms.
I'm not a huge fan of the life tenure because I just think that you get into like this generational gridlock where you've only got people from a certain generation that are on there forever, and they have the incentive to hold on because, as you pointed out earlier, the whole judicial appointment process is very politicized. So if you have a seat and you were appointed by a Democrat, and there's now a Republican president, a Republican Senate, you're basically forced to sit up there.
Yeah.
Even if you're like, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and you've had 4 cancer operations.
Yeah.
And you're getting sick all the time, and
some of these people literally went to school with Martin Luther King. Like, not literally went to school, but like they were in elementary school at the same damn time.
Right. I mean, these are, I'm not. I mean, you want. I think a good court should be composed of a diversity of perspectives, and that includes young and old, along with every other form of diversity, and giving people an incentive to hold on, basically forcing them. I don't know if Ruth Bader Ginsburg is really even free to step down if she wants to at this point. I mean, if she were to step down, there would be an outcry from the Democratic establishment that you're basically handing a Supreme Court seat appointment to Trump.
I mean, but they didn't outcry when Kennedy stepped down, so they might be okay with it. If the Democrats told her to step down, they'd be okay with it. But they basically told Kennedy to step down.
But I mean, that's, they portray her as like the last line, remaining between her and, the complete illegalization of abortion and destruction of women's rights in this country.
Which is not true. By the way, listen, y'all, Roe v. Wade is not about to be, like, they've already upheld it. I mean, they've already upheld it.
Well, they've upheld it, although they kind of are, trying to take the teeth out of it gradually, and you're starting to see some real efforts in that direction.
Alabama's got overturned. Their abortion law.
But I think in Louisiana they just upheld, or
they're federal court.
They're hearing a case now. I'm sorry, they're hearing a case now involving Louisiana that, and apparently this was reported last week. The argument was very contentious with Roberts and the Republicans asking questions about why this law shouldn't be upheld, and they portray Ruth Ginsburg as being sort of the one voice on there that's keeping them from completely gutting the whole thing. So that puts a lot of pressure on somebody. So she can't step down. From the Democratic, strategy perspective, she probably should have stepped down during Obama's first term.
So he could have nominated somebody.
Yeah, but she didn't do it. And then Obama tried to appoint that one vacancy, and he couldn't even get his nominee through. I mean, so...
Then the Democrats, basically fast-track.
Yeah.
They hold him up for months.
Right.
And then, all right, whatever, give it to him.
Right.
We were so mad a week ago, but hey, whatever.
Right. So it's gotten to this ridiculous level of animosity and hyper-politicization. And it really, whenever Roberts gets up there and says, the court is neutral and rules without fear or favor, I don't really know how many people in this country believe that for a second.
Hell no.
I mean, it's really hard to take that seriously when you actually are watching this process.
You're like, a Republican's going to be a president, and you're worried about losing abortion rights. Clearly. And your only reason for that is, we have a Republican president. He's going to put Republican justices. That's your only reason. Right. So clearly it's hyper politicized.
Right, but I don't think it leads to the best composition of a court when that's the people on there, that's what's on their minds, and not actually deciding cases according to the facts and the law, which is what they're supposed to do. And as an attorney, you have to deal with this, but you can only do so much, right? You put your best arguments forward, you cross your fingers. That's what we're going to do. Mm-hmm. In a couple weeks, the brief will be available for public consumption. We'll make that available on our website. so people can
jampack.us.
Yeah, and look out for. You're not going to hear about it in the media. There's not going to be any articles or on CNN or Fox. You're going to have to do your own research and investigation, and I encourage people, especially if they're coming to the process now in 2020,
which a lot of people are.
Which, of course, a lot of people, they're first-time voters. Everybody has a first time, that they get involved with this stuff. But if you really want to sort of understand the context of what's been going on in terms of what happened 4 years ago, this case is a good resource because it's got there's a lot of records in the case.
It's a story.
There's a lot of arguments. There's a lot of documents that you can read and start piecing things together, and then things may make sense to you that don't make sense when you go out there and you're like, why is like obvious voter fraud or election fraud, I should say, happening in these states? I mean, the exit polls and the actual results don't match at all. You have clear instances of ballot suppression going on. Why is it that this is allowed to happen and there's no repercussion? Well, now you can actually see the answer to that become clearer and clearer. I think it make people feel less anxiety, and actually may lead to some productive thinking about how we solve it. I don't know. I don't really have like solutions.
Well, we're working on. We're working on solutions.
We're working on trying to identify the problem.
Exactly.
And I think that's what this lawsuit is about. And we are trying to get relief and for the people that were defrauded in 2016.
And on that note, I'm glad you said that. We're really what we have to start doing before we actually start to introduce real solutions is identify the problem, and that's ultimately what this lawsuit is about. That's why Jared and Liz literally put their families' lives in danger, not only their own. Obviously me as well. Everybody's associated with them. Everybody who's a plaintiff in this. We don't know what the outcome will be, but at the the realist level, it's not really about the result necessarily, because you can get a great result, just have some restitution and retribution, but they go on and do the same thing.
Well, that's what happened.
Different ways.
That's what happened to Dr. Nixon when he won in the Supreme Court the first time.
And they just went a different way. But with the discovery that the Democratic Party legitimately believes they can screw their people and not have any repercussions. The mindset. You understand how they work. A lot of people are learning about the justice system, on the politics side through this case. There are a lot of reasons to fight. Right. And like I've always said, you don't define your victories in the same way that the establishment does. If you define your victories by who gets whatever office and what a ruling the judge that potentially could be corrupt or co-opted in some way, form, or fashion, you'll never be happy, you'll never be satisfied. But you have to do the process, you have to go through the process. And that's what Jared and Liz are trying to do. That's what we're trying to do here. It's even when I tell people it's important to vote and people ask me why, I say I'm not saying your vote's going to count the way you think it is, but what it does give us is accountability, right? If you can say, if 100 million people can say they voted for this person and we can prove it, that helps us do things like this. Right. And that's basically what took place. So
well, and you basically become evidence of voter suppression.
Exactly.
Or you're at the polling place. You see what's going on.
You see what's happening. You can speak. You can be a witness in a case such as this one. And trust me, a lot of y'all might be getting called up. Just letting you know. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Jared, once again for doing what you do.
Thank you, my friend.
We'll keep you all updated. The case, you're turning in paperwork on the 26th, right?
26th.
And you know how soon after? We'll be hearing back?
No idea. Usually it's like within a month or 2 months you get some kind of initial order.
This is an unusual case, so we ain't even going to try to pretend like we know if that's... Literally, I feel like it was like a year went by since the...
Right, all the usual rules don't apply, though.
Yeah, but thank you all so much for tuning into this segment of Mikasa Sukasa, and always remember, more than anything else, find your balance, people. Peace.